Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Did Shakespeare. My name is Cassidy Cash. This week, we're going to be looking at names in Elizabethan England and exploring exactly why William Shakespeare was named William Shakespeare. Specifically, we're going to be asking, did Shakespeare have a middle name? As always here at Did Shakespeare, we like to get right to the point. So the short answer to this question is no. William Shakespeare did not have a middle name. But do you know why? In Elizabethan England, babies were baptized about 3 days before they were born, which is exactly how we measure when we think William Shakespeare was born. We have a baptismal record showing he was baptized on April 26th, and so we calculate back 3 days to say, well, that means he must have been born on April 23rd. There are multiple pieces of evidence in addition to the baptismal records that people use to approximate when Shakespeare was born, but that's one of the main ones. When a baby was born in Elizabethan England, they would have been named by their parents, but interestingly, it wasn't their parents that took them to be baptized. It was actually their godparents. The preferred setup for godparents were 3 people. You'd either have 2 men and a lady, or 2 ladies and a man, depending on if you were a boy or a girl. It was a common practice to select godparents that were a higher station than the parents themselves. As an example, in 1606, when William Davenant was baptized, William Shakespeare was actually his godfather. This is an interesting fact about Shakespeare, actually, because it's an understood fact that William Shakespeare was actually William Davenant's godfather, and it's disputed whether or not William Shakespeare might have been William Davenant's biological father. But when I went to look at the baptismal records, the only baptismal record I was able to find showed that William Shakespeare was born on April 26th and that he was the son of John Shakespeare. There's not anything in the baptismal record that indicates who the godparents were. So I don't know exactly how we know who William Davenant's godfather was. Apparently, there is evidence out there to make this connection. I just wasn't able to find it ahead of this video. When you're researching baptismal records, you'll find a lot of references to the baptismal records being comparable to today's birth certificates, and that's not quite right. The baptismal records are actually quite limited. You know, a birth certificate lists your parents and where you live and your parents' occupation. Recently, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge had a baby, and so their baby's birth certificate is all over the internet, and you can go and look at that as a great example of just the vast amount of information that you get on a person through their birth certificate. When William Shakespeare was born, it's one line in a parish register, and you can go and look at Shakespeare Documented. The Folger Shakespeare Library has actually put William Shakespeare's baptismal record in digital form available at shakespearedocumented.com, and I'll link to that below the video. You are able to see digital copies of these records like Shakespeare's baptism record without having to get on a plane. So that's a wonderful resource you should definitely check out. At any rate, one of the important roles of godparents was that usually the child was named after the godparents. In cases where we know the child's name and the godparent's name, 85% of those people were named after their godparents. The person that you were named after and yourself were known as namesakes. Your first name was your Christian or given name, and it's the one that stayed with you for your entire life. You might have a shortened version or a nickname. If you had a name like William, people might call you Will. If you were named Johann, people might call you John, all these different shortened versions, but your first name stayed with you for your whole life. What's interesting about Elizabethan England, though, is that unlike today, your last name, even if you were a boy, might change. In Western culture, we're used to the idea that a woman's name might change. We have the idea of a maiden name, and when a woman gets married, she changes her last name. But men often keep their last name on through their entire lives, and it is inherited from their father. For Elizabethan England, though, the last name, even for boys, might change. And as an example, you can look at Robert Dudley, who was the patron of Leicester's men, who were the first company of players to hold a royal patent. Robert Dudley was born Robert Sutton, but he bought the Dudley lands and title, and after that, he started calling himself Robert Dudley, and his family adopted the Dudley name as well. And you'll even see in some records from Robert Dudley's lifetime, he is actually referred to as Robert Dudley alias Sutton. It was also common in Elizabethan times for your name to morph. There was a much smaller pool of available names during Elizabethan times, and so there might be a lot of people in your particular town or village with the same name. And so sometimes you would adopt a last name that applied to either your occupation or something about your physical attributes that made you able to stand out against the other ones. So for example, if you've got 5 John Smiths all living in the same village, the one that's a baker might start being called John Baker, or the man who is the horseshoer might start being called John Ferrier. And it's the idea that you would adopt a last name that helped distinguish you from the other people. And then, of course, when those people had kids, they would pass this assumed name onto their children so that the children could be tied to them in the same way. And this is the way we got new last names. As far as keeping records and keeping track of all this name changing and who goes with who, it wouldn't be until Elizabeth I and then later Charles I established laws for managing and governing the poor that would produce what we now think of as the birth certificate. They passed laws that made it so the poor had to register themselves in the town that they lived in, and they had to produce this registration to be able to move. It was not a particularly kind law, and so the fact that we have birth certificates now is good. The reason why we have them and the history that comes out of, not so much. But it wouldn't be until 1836 with the Births and Deaths Registration Act passed in England that we now have what we think of as the birth certificate to keep track of what your last name is and where that came from. Which means that for William Shakespeare, the only record we have of his birth date is from his baptismal record and a note on his grave that says he was in his 53rd year of life when he died, which means he was 52 years old. And we also know from his records, as well as the culture of Elizabethan England during which he was living, that William Shakespeare did not have a middle name. That's it for this week here at Did Shakespeare. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. If you liked this video, please hit like and subscribe. We love our friends here at That Shakespeare Girl, and we would love to be friends with you. Please hit subscribe and you'll be notified of new episodes, and you can catch every one. We do new videos here each week on Saturdays, all about Shakespeare. We ask an interesting question about the life and times of William Shakespeare to start an interesting conversation with you. So leave us a comment or come visit us at castycash.com to find out more. As an announcement, I have recently launched That Shakespeare Society. It is an online book and fan club for people who love William Shakespeare. Each month we read a scholarly book like Will in the World by Stephen Greenblatt, or we might read 1599 by James Shapiro. It changes every month. We have a book of the month, and then we meet virtually to discuss this book. We also have weekly history lessons where we move strategically through Shakespeare's plays and look at the history in each little section. So if we're reading King Henry VI Part 1, we're going to look at the history behind that play, not just the history Shakespeare based it on, but what was going on in Shakespeare's life when he wrote it. And we'll move through all 37 plays that way. There's travel discounts, there's freebies, there's diagrams, there's history, and there's tons of Shakespeare. So if you would like to study Shakespeare more in depth than what we do here at Did Shakespeare, you can join That Shakespeare Society. Simply go to castycash.com/society to learn more and to sign up. That'll do it for this week here at Did Shakespeare. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I'll see you next week.